This thing was partially prompted by some comment, Mother, in a recent family letter about one of the places you lived that you saw recently when you went down into Central Texas. And I didn't remember ever hearing that particular name. It dawned on me that there are quite a few other gaps in terms of time where you had lived and when you had done some of those things that I knew about but didn't know exactly what you were doing and when. So I was interested in getting some sort of record of some of those kinds of things and thought this would be a convenient way of doing it if we can.
Yeah.
And before we get too far, we ought to mention that this is the last day of 1983, just for a general record. But if you could give whatever kind of summary of principal places you lived growing up and maybe anything that struck you about those in particular, when other siblings were born along the way and that kind of thing, and then on up through Clarksville and everywhere else, the names that I've heard but don't know how to put together.
Well, I'll see if I can keep them straightened out, Brad. I expect the place you heard mention of, would that have been my grandparents' home that has just been torn down?
Possibly. What's the name of the town?
Well, it's out about 15 miles out of Lampasas,
Well,
just out on the ranch. We went by there as we came home from Carlos in September, just to see where the house had been. Just the concrete steps were all that was left.
that may have been it. That sounds familiar.
But then we did come through a town on our way from there where my older brother was born. Would that have been Copper's Cove, maybe was the place you thought of? Anyway, I never lived there, but my parents were teaching there, or my dad was, when he was born.
Okay.
That's just a little town, not far from Lampasas.
Okay.
Anyway, then
What's Lampasas nearest to that anyone
would have heard
outside of the area would have heard of?
west of Austin. I think
Okay.
it's about 50, 60 miles, something of that nature. So then, after my parents left Copper's Cove, maybe almost directly, they moved up near Ferris, Texas, which is just a little bit south of Dallas. Do you happen to remember ever being through there? Perhaps on 45?
If it's on 45, then I've probably been
maybe
through.
75. Anyway, it was the road to Houston in those days.
Yeah.
So they taught in little schools out from there for a few years, and I was born when my dad was teaching in a school called India. That's how I got to be born in India. From there, when I was, I think, about 6 months old, they moved to a little town called Alma, just north of Corsicana, I believe, short distance. Were there only, I think, a year and a half, perhaps, moved from there to Quanah. You know where that is?
Yeah, okay.
That's almost
major
to the
metropolis,
Red River. Well, we did not live in the town of Quanah. They taught at a little school out from there. I believe that brother and I stayed with my Aunt Vivian, who lived on a farm near there. Actually, Dad tried to farm while teaching. I think that didn't work out too well, but he was there, I guess, 1 or 2 years. I'm not sure. Maybe just 1. We moved from there to Branchville, Texas, which is again in central Texas, near Cameron. Have you heard of that one?
Don't recall it.
It's out of Waco, isn't it?
Yes, that's southeast of Waco a little bit. He taught there 3 years, and that's where I started the first grade, in Branchville, at age 4. Then he went to chiropractic school for a couple of years, and Mother and my older brother and I moved to Maysfield, a little town just up the road about 8 miles, where my Aunt Julia and Aunt Carol were both teaching in the school, and Mother taught there. So we were there 1 year while he was in school. I guess he was in one long term and several summers.
He was in Waco for that?
No, that was San Antonio. And we spent the summers then on either end of that year in San Antonio. When he finished there then, went to Briery, a little school, a short distance out of Rosebud, Texas. Rosebud, again, is a short distance from Cameron.
Rosebud, I'm supposed to know from something else.
Well, my cousin Max lives there now. Maybe you've heard us speak of it from that standpoint. We were there 2 years. I was in the 3rd and 4th grades there. 3rd grade in Mother's room, as a matter of fact.
Mm-hmm.
The summer in between those 2 years, Mother and my Aunt Carol went to school in Canyon, Texas. There was a teacher's college there. And my brother and I were in the summer demonstration school.
Now, is that where West Texas State is now?
That's where it is, the same
The
school.
school.
Same school, same building, some of them. Then, after the 2nd year in Briery, we spent a summer in Waco while Dad was in school at Baylor, along with Uncle Dan and Aunt Maud. All of whose kids played together with us. We lived in the same house for that summer. Then we moved to Haslett.
So this was this is late 20s or so by then?
That was in fall of 25 that we moved to Haslett.
Okay.
Joyce was born there in January of 26. 26. We were at Haslett 4 years. I was in grades 5, 6, 7, and 8 there, and studied through the next summer so that I was ready for the 10th grade when we moved to Arlington in the fall of, or in August of 1929.
Should I turn this off, or do you, is that distracting?
It doesn't matter.
Okay.
So we've been in and out of Arlington ever since. I guess.
That sounds significantly more migratory than even I had thought.
You even knew about it.
Yeah.
Mm.
Country school teachers, Brad, in those days were pretty impermanent creatures.
That's why I was about to ask what the reason behind it.
Usually there was a school board of 3 trustees. Pretty hard to please very long at a time. If there was any friction with anybody's kids or anything, it was very common for country school teachers to move about pretty frequently. And my dad was not exactly famous for his tact. So he may have moved a little more than some. Actually, the places we were 3 and 4 years, we considered quite unusual.
Long term.
And moving in those days was something, an undertaking too. I mean, it's not like hopping in your car and going someplace, but you imagine a journey to Canyon, Texas, or to Buena, which is a pretty good drive even today. Well, moving and all of that, that must have been quite an undertaking.
Of course, I don't remember that move, but I expect it was. And people didn't usually hire a big van or anything to move them, but maybe get a friend that had a truck or a wagon
Horse and wagon.
to load up the things. One thing made it simpler, though, there were not many possessions to move. Our furniture was quite sparse. Actually, the years after we left Branchville, where we had furniture Dad had made in shop classes, an oak divan with a black horsehair type cover to the seat, and a nice oak library table, and bookcases, and several things like that. When we left Branchville, and he was going to be in school for a year or so, all that was sold, and we moved in with our aunts in Maysfield. So after that, we had precious little furniture. actually the packing boxes, big strong wooden boxes that we packed things in for the move, were converted into kitchen table and cabinet type things with curtains in front of them at the Priory. So then we didn't really have much furniture again until we moved to Haslett, where we had furnished a full.
Well, did the teacherage, as you call them, or corresponding to parsonages, were they
Yes,
furnished?
Yeah.
They
Country
were
schools
furnished.
frequently furnished to teachers.
Well, I know, but the furniture in
Oh,
them,
no.
they were barren.
That's right, just the house.
Hmm.
We would have a dining table and chairs. Same one, I guess, through all that time, around and a kitchen cabinet. No cabinet at Priory. It was when we moved to Haslett, then we got a new cabinet. New living room suit that we thought was so fabulous. We'd not had a matched set before. And a nice wood bedroom set. We previously had just had iron bedsteads and continue to have a couple of them.
That was rugged living. I'll tell you, when you think of her dad and mom going from place to place year after year.
And sometimes a couple of times within a year.
And then compared with my background, we lived on one farm. Well, I was born there, through all common school, through high school. The folks stayed there through my time at Rose Poly. And after I got a job and went to New York, but folks still owned the farm. Same one place only.
What about previous to that time? How did your parents get a hold of that farm?
Well, their parents lived just on down the way toward Center Point, you know. Granddaddy Scharf lived 6 miles away from where our farm was. Granddaddy Sickle was about 5 miles away. So they were all congregated in that area. We didn't go, certainly didn't move any place and didn't travel very far out during all of those years.
The purchase of the farm itself was,
My dad was a school teacher too, and a farmer, and they just settled. He did live at Knightsville at one time. I think before, well, I'm pretty sure it was before they got the farm. But I don't, Robert wasn't even, he might have been not born on the farm, I'm not sure, my older brother. But the rest of us were all born right there on the farm.
Including Mazo.
I would think so, yeah. Though I may be wrong about Robert, I'm not sure whether they had him while they were in Knightsville or not.
Did your dad teach at Knightsville?
He taught there, and then the little red schoolhouses around in the Jackson Township community. That's where his tour of duty was around that way. But compared with her family moving around over Texas, that just sounds like gypsies.
Yes,
Because people were just stayed in one place and lived there and farmed and did their work, whatever.
But now, Mother, was that also characteristic of the rest of Granddaddy's family? You mentioned teaming up with Uncle Dan or other aunts and uncles at various places.
I guess school teachers were something of a premium in those days. So a whole flock of the family would teach together in one school. For instance, the school at Ferris, Uncle Dan, Aunt May, Aunt Maud, I think Aunt Cara, and a niece, Nola Gross, who's Ola's older sister. I believe all taught there at one time. It might have been Nola was in school, but I think she taught there. And maybe Dad went to school there at the time. He was somewhat younger than some. No, if Aunt May taught there, he wouldn't have been going to school. But anyway, they would congregate and a number of them teach in one school.
Well, I think maybe Uncle Dan was quite an operator too, when he would get into school and then recommend all of his relatives, and he had such a big good reputation of his own. Well, I'm sure any recommendation that he made, he could go out and get his relatives for associate teachers pretty well.
Apparently, school teachers were apparently not too easy to come by in those days, so they did, and as to moving, I don't know whether they moved as frequently as Dad did or not, but they taught a number of different parts of the state. At Davila, a little town in central Texas, southeast of Waco, down not far from Rosebud, I think. A whole bunch of them taught that way, and there was quite a reputation. You know, the school at Davila was something people sent their kids to. I heard about that from man when I was in college. I went to visit a friend of mine in Fort Worth, and we were playing tennis. Well, she knew this fellow, and he came up. She introduced him, and he stuck out his hand and said, "Are you Oscar Roark's girl?" I said, "Yes, how'd you know?" And he said, "I'm from Davila, and the Roarks had a real school there," and he just went on about it.
What about finding lodging and houses and stuff like that? There were teachers, as you say, in most of these places. But
Well, in some of the country schools, they had a teacherage, but unmarried teachers would stay in the homes of people in the neighborhood and board with someone there. In the school at Branchville, where I started first grade, the first grade teacher boarded at our house. And mother served meals to her as well as the rest of the family.
what about beyond that then? You got, what, class of 31 at AHS? And
When we moved here, now Dad and Mother both were teaching at John T. White School, which is northwest of Arlington, about 6 or 7 miles. But my older brother was ready for college, is the main reason we wanted to come to this area. He entered school at NTAC, which is now the University of Texas of Arlington. That we drove daily out to this little school. I started school out there with them in the 10th grade. Went until midterm. In December of that year, the school burned out there on a blustery, windy day when the school was without water. There was a little pump house just back of the school where water was pumped, and one of the boys had gone down to start the little house in the motor, and the spark somehow caught the little frame building on fire, and the wind was very high and quickly spread to the tar roof of the school building. We hadn't had even water to drink, so there was no water to do anything about a fire, and it burned down. So that school had to continue in a little church building nearby under very trying circumstances. So at the midterm, I started school in Arlington, and that was January of 30. So I was just in Arlington High for a year and a half. Graduating in 31. Then,
which was in what kind of building at that time?
what is now Cooper's Center at the, what was Owsley when we
Okay.
moved here.
Okay.
Yeah, same building. I went back there the year after graduation because we didn't have the money for me to start to college at that point, and I was still within school age limit, so the school was available to me, and I went back and took typing and shorthand and bookkeeping. Then the following year started school at NTAC.
Okay, now somewhere in that period too, there was Texas Electric job. What
Okay.
was that?
After I attended NTAC 2 years, my parents were then teaching at a little school near Grapevine called Carroll Hill. I went over just to live with them because I didn't have money to go anywhere else, and it was in the middle of the Great Depression and jobs were just about non-available. But after a few weeks over there, my aunt and uncle in Dallas, that's Uncle Doc and Aunt Eula, called and said they had a job for me. A lawyer they knew was moving from Waco to Dallas, and they were turning some business his way from insurance claims.
Which is, what was their business?
They were in the United States Fidelity and Guarantee Company, a big insurance company. Both worked for that in Dallas. So because they were befriending this lawyer, apparently he was willing to take on their niece as his stenographer. The pay was a handsome $5 a week. So I went over and stayed in their home and started work there. After a few weeks, my Uncle Dan and his family invited me to come to their house and sort of fill in as babysitter. Little Jeff was about a little over a year old then. And since I felt beholden to Uncle Doc and Aunt Eula because I was just staying there and wasn't able to pay them anything, I felt that I sort of could help out Uncle Dan's by helping with the babysitting, and I wouldn't feel quite so much indebted. So I went there and continued to live with them then from about November through until April.
So that was still in Dallas.
Right. I worked there then for this lawyer for about 4 months or a little better, I guess. At that time, a vacancy happened at Texas Electric Service here in Arlington, and the manager asked the business department at NTAC to recommend an Arlington student who could fill the place, and they recommended me and got in touch with me, and I was overjoyed because it paid $75 a month. I said, heaven.
Pretty substantial.
It was pretty substantial compared to what people were earning then. I had had a raise to $6 1/4 a week, but still I was really fabulously delighted to get that job. So I worked there then from April of 35 until September of 37. When I went back to school at then.
So the amount of time at NTAC was
2 years.
two pretty full years.
Yes. Well, I didn't go through the summer.
But aiming, was that already biology or was that something else?
I became enamored of biology there because I had such a splendid professor, as Mr. Hughes, and I did just take to it quite readily because of his skill in teaching it. So then when I went on to North Texas State University, that's what I decided to major in.
So 37 to North Texas, and 2 years there to finish up, and then then teaching on your own.
Yes, I taught 2 years at Edinburgh in the Rio Grande Valley. Taught in what they called the junior school, or the middle school, I believe they called it. It was an experimental school of the Southern study of universities and colleges, I think. It was organized on the 4-4-4 plan.
Right, okay.
Texas was still having just 11 grades at that point, but they were looking towards the time they would have 12. And those schools were organized theoretically, the first 4, then the middle 4, and the high school. But since they had only 11 at that time, I believe the middle school had only 5th, 6th, and 7th grades. The high school was still 8 through 11. So I taught elementary science there. Had 353 students, many of whom were Mexican, with names like Agapita de la Garza and Maria de Jesus Esteves. And I had alternating classes. I met one group of students on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and another group on Tuesday and Thursday. The 8th period classes on Tuesday and Thursday never got their names fixed in my mind at all. Never could call them by name if I saw them someplace else in the building.
300 and how many?
53.
Wow.
It was kind of ridiculous, really. But because there were also so many kids and faculty fairly limited, I did have to teach some other things too, which I really didn't know anything about. I had a class or two in reading, I think, and maybe in social studies, I think, at some time or other for a short time. And there were no texts for elementary science available. So I started out just having to make work for them, make up worksheets every day and that sort of thing. For that many kids, it got to be kind of a job. I did then ask if they would allow me to order workbooks for them. They could do that only if kids paid for them. A lot of the poor little kids, that was a hardship for them, but they did order. And I guess the kids that just couldn't pay, maybe the school took up the slack or something. I can't remember about that. Anyway, with workbooks, it wasn't so bad.
I think I'm beginning to see why you didn't stick with teaching all that long.
That was pretty good.
So you said that was 2 years.
Yes, after 2 years, I was ready to move on from there. Had an opportunity to go to Port Arthur at a little better salary, but it was another experimental school, and I never had wanted to live on the coast or near the coast. I don't care for the damp climate that is experienced there, so I began looking for other schools and came back to Arlington, where my people were still living, to spend the summer, and got a job in Dallas as secretary in International Truck branch of International Harvester, but the farm machinery was in a different branch. This was just in truck branch.
This is the thing you brought up last summer, I guess, that an
You
episode
didn't
that
know
I had
about
never
this?
heard about. Yeah.
I worked there during that summer and really enjoyed that. In fact, I was seriously toying with the idea of going back to office work because I had really enjoyed my time at Texas Electric. Just really liked secretarial work and thought I would do that. But then when I had an opportunity to teach at Clarksville, those 3 months off in the summer were very interesting too. I wanted to do some traveling and things like that. So I did go back to teaching. Went to Clarksville, taught there just 1 year.
And that was the school year of
1940, 41, 42, I believe, Brad. Wait a minute. Yes, that would have had to be 41, 42. I had biology, senior science, and general science in high school. Poor kids.
In high school, this was in high
This
school.
was high school.
But it was a certificate different from the elementary grades? than
My
high school?
certificate was for secondary education.
Everything else.
Apparently, if your certificate was in secondary, it was assumed you could teach anything below that, I guess was the way it worked in those days. I think people didn't make too much of special training for little kids. You knew enough to teach high school, you knew enough to teach anybody. But that was, it was an interesting year, but as I said, I was a total flop as a teacher. So when spring came, my roommate was going to New York City to be married to her soldier fiancé. and wanted me to go along with her and be in her wedding. I had always wanted to go to school at Cornell, which had a reputation for a very good biology department. So I thought I would see if I could combine the two, and applied there and was accepted for the summer term. So I went up with her in June, was at her wedding, then went on up to Ithaca and had the, I'm not sure whether that was the first or the second year. The first or the second of the two summer sessions. I guess it was the first one in Ithaca.
Okay, so that was first time out of Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas kind of region?
I think plain first time out of Texas, other than maybe right across the Red River when we lived at Quanah or something of that kind.
Right.
I think it was the very first time out of Texas. I was 25 years old. No, take it back. I had been in Mexico when teaching in the Valley. Went to Monterey.
Which is a fairly decent job itself, no doubt.
150 miles. Wasn't considered so spectacular at that point. But this was the first time in other states.
Okay, so one summer term in Cornell.
Then I came back through New York City to visit the couple whose wedding I'd been in.
Is this anybody that we know?
Ruth and Leighton Cornett. You
Okay.
remember them, don't you?
Well,
They've
certainly
been
remember
here.
the names, but I knew
Been
they'd
here a
been.
time or two. She was my roommate in Denton. in
There are
Clarksville.
pictures in our wedding whenever you've seen her. I guess he wasn't in the wedding.
No. Then I was going to return home by way of Washington, D.C., just to see the city. And while there, a friend got me a job there right away. After the first couple of days of sightseeing, I went to work. I'd seen more in that weekend than I saw the rest of the time I was there, probably. But I was there from August of 42 until April of 45.
So that was, where were you when Pearl Harbor hit then?
In Clarksville.
Still in Clarksville, okay. Right, that would have been following summer. All right. So by that time, then it was clear, it was also in Washington already a kind of a war mentality.
Definitely. That's the only reason that I was able to get a job there. Yes, they were creating these emergency offices right and left. Office for Emergency Management encompassed 13 different agencies. One of them was the Office of Scientific Research and Development. Under that was the National Defense Research Committee, which had quite a number of divisions, and I worked in one of the divisions there as a secretary. I was there I worked at that until the end of 44, I guess it was. Everybody was frozen into their jobs in those agencies. I guess it was difficult enough to get people that they wouldn't let you go to another job in the government. But I was beginning to think about coming back to Texas and wanted to be prepared to work at something as I studied medicine if I didn't find whoever I was going to marry in a short while. I was getting along in years. I was 28 by that time.
I didn't realize that either, that you were pretty seriously considering.
Yes, and that's why I studied medical technology. I thought I might be able to work at that as I would, or work my way through school, through medical school.
Okay, now that's another episode. You studied that while in Washington on the side?
No, not on the side. That's when I left the government then.
Which was in
the end of 44.
Okay, all right.
then beginning January of 45, I started as an intern at Doctor's Hospital in the laboratory. Was doing that then when Dad and I decided to get married.
And when did you actually meet?
That must have been about October of 44.
Well, maybe earlier than that, I'm not sure. 40.
When did you come to Washington?
Well, I was down there in 43, I guess it was. Because I went in 42 and spent just a little over a year in Edgewood, and then went on down to Washington.
Okay, so it was in about October of 43 then, I
I would
guess
think
we
so,
met.
yeah.
So you knew each other a couple of years,
Yes,
basically.
but of course, he was engaged to another gal about that time. I didn't see much of him.
Well, here's a new one totally. No, this is a totally new one.
That was just a passing fancy.
Oh, yeah, he was just waiting to see me, of course.
Passing fancy.
Anyway, we didn't date until, I guess, about September of 44, wasn't it? We're
I
on
guess
the
that's
fall
right.
of 44.
We went to the same church, the same young people's meeting, but saw each other off and on casually there.
I remember very well the day that he first came to that group. The evening fellowship was a meal. We had a light little snack served. There were lots of young people in this group. And they introduced the new people that had come each time. There were two people, two soldiers this time. One was Daddy and one was a fellow that I'd gone to school with in Denton. And after the thing, they usually stood someplace where everybody could come by and get acquainted and say hi. And after speaking to them both, I thought, I sure wish it was the other guy I'd gone to school with. You'd get a little head start.
Okay, that's interesting. That did fill in several gaps. So you were still actively pursuing was the medical technology thing a short term?
It was a one-year apprenticeship, and then you took the national exams after that.
Okay.
So I was still doing that. Had actually just been employed as the night technician there at the Doctor's Hospital, having promised myself I was not going to get married then. I was coming back to Texas and marry some guy in Texas. And I didn't, I guess I underestimated Daddy's powers of persuasion. Just before I actually started work.
Well, she went ahead and studied after we got married and went ahead and took her exams for medical technology
Back in Brazil.
certificate and certification, whatever. Completed all that work afterwards, just as a matter of completing something she had started. So that made it pretty interesting that she was a medical technologist. I remember writing my folks, I'm getting involved with a girl who is school teacher, a medical technologist, and a secretary. And so that pretty well sold them. She must be a wizard-izzer. Which I didn't do anything to discourage them about.
They probably thought, my goodness, the poor thing can't settle on any one thing.
Maybe we ought to slightly shift gears if you guys can still stay awake a bit longer. And Daddy, since there wasn't quite so much jumping around in the early stages, I think I've got things fairly clear on where you were basically through Rose Poly and perhaps even slightly after that. But were there any particular summer jobs or things away from Brazil and Rose during that?
No, during Rose Polytechnic, summer jobs there was with the feed store in Brazil with my dad.
Okay.
Business there and working still on the farm. They still had the farm when they had the business there. So I would work either at the store or they had a hay baler. And one summer I took the hay baler, which had been discarded on the farm, and reworked it and then went out on my own and baled hay for people and made quite a lot of money in those days during that summer.
Let's see, when did the store get started, and was that after teaching ended, or did all that run parallel for a while?
No, it didn't get started until about 1923 or 4, I think. My dad was on the farm for quite a while, and then he worked as a manager or a supervisor for the Farm Bureau, which was a feed and seed company there in Brazil, along with the farm. He worked that before he went out on his own. And then it became, he and Robert primarily started the business in 1923 and 24.
Had he been out of teaching for some time
Yeah,
already at
yes,
that point?
he'd been out of teaching for quite a while, a long time, as a matter of fact. He was primarily a farmer up until he went into this Farm Bureau situation. And then I worked for them in the summers of 25 through 29, finished Rose Poly, and went to Bell System in New York City.
When in there were you in Michigan at a summer ROTC camp or
Well,
something?
that's between the junior and senior year as in the ROTC program. We took 6 weeks in regular military training as part of the commission
Yeah.
that you get at 4 year.
Greg,
4 years of
same thing, Greg spent at Fort Sill, I think,
Mhm.
nearly died. Greg did the similar thing at Fort Sill, I
I'm sure
think.
they did. Yeah, that was standard procedure for all of the military trained people to go through 4 years, and then between the junior and senior year, there's 6 weeks in some military installation.
ROTC was mandatory at Rose?
No, it was elective. I think almost everybody took it though, but I'm sure it was elective.
Okay.
But then I went to New York City with the Bell System, and
That was
that was a big
29.
jump, of course, for, I'm just a little green country kid, and it was quite a deal to be employed. They had recruiters around, like they do, send around even now to
Yeah.
colleges to interview the senior people. And since I was a chemical engineer major, I could have either gone to DuPont in Wilmington, Delaware, or the Bell System in New York, and I think 1 or 2 other places, but the Bell System offered the most attractive thing, and so I went there at 29, and then that same, that was in the spring of 29, and that fall was the Great Depression started, the crash of 29, and regardless, things were not that bad in the Bell System till for 2 or 3 years. So I stayed with them for 3.5 years, I believe it was, until 32, and we were down to 4 days a week work, which had been a cutback, and a number of people had been let off, but I was still there. But I got the idea, well, if all things are kind of quiet and they were not booming much, I would go down to Hopkins and get my PhD, because I could see in the technical work that I was in the Bell System that an advanced degree would be desirable. So I took off then in the fall of 32, I believe it was, and went down to Hopkins for graduate work.
But in the meantime, you had a CHE awarded
Yeah,
by
well,
virtue
you
of
get that on the basis of
practical experience.
practical experience in writing a thesis. So I wrote the thesis on work that I had done in the Bell System, and sent that in and completed the. It was required that you had 5 years experience, and I've completed at the end of about 3.5 and sent it in, and they said, well, the work is satisfactory, but you just have to wait till the end of the 5-year time before we could award you the degree. So I was in no particular hurry for it. I just okay. So I went to Hopkins and then stayed a 1.5 years or a year and 3/4, and was in there when my dad died in Indiana, got killed in an automobile accident. And that was probably the traumatic decision that I had to make then, was to decide whether to continue on or do something else. I was financially independent and all, but
You'd been able to save enough during the Bell deal to
Yep.
pay for that and to be able to take.
I had a scholarship or a fellowship to Hopkins that helped out too, but it didn't pay everything, but I had enough money to work on it. So anyway, with the family wanting me to, or thought I could go, that I could go back and go into business with Robert. And, that's what I decided to do. And that was a major turnaround, I don't mind telling you.
Yeah, I can imagine.
But anyway, I did. And got my degree then after I got back to Brazil. I was in the feed business. Well, then I went over to Rose Poly, one of those 34 would be, and picked up my advanced degree over there. And then just settled in and worked. Worked for 20 years.
Wait a minute, that simplifies a couple of things. First of all, was there an agreement with Bell that you were on a leave and would have a
No,
place
I
when
was
you came
on
back?
I resigned. I asked them about a leave of absence when I went down there. And of course, they, at that point, they were letting off people kind of right and left. They had to cut back.
Looking for
I
excuses,
lost
basically.
a lot of my friends there in the same technical thing. And the head of the department said, well, the way things are, a leave of absence is a one-way street. If you want to come back, you don't have to come back, but we have to take you if we give you a leave of absence. So he said, under the circumstances, I believe you just, if you want to go, you can go on your own. And so I did. I even in the face of the depression, I didn't have sense enough to know that that would be a tough proposition. Just went ahead and did it. And I did try to get back, because then I went and worked with the business and stayed there for, well, of course, the first run was up until 41 with Pearl Harbor. That was from 34 to 41. That's a pretty good stretch there. Just hard work. And then at 41 went into service. And 4 years there. And the last year of that then is where I hooked up with Mom.
Okay. All right, you had your commission from ROTC had run out, so you had to re-sign up and go through OCS.
Yeah, I did.
Okay.
It ran out at the end of 5 years under normal circumstances. I took some out of our courses and some correspondence courses. You know, you can keep active if you want to. But it was so in the mid-30s or the late 30s, we'll say, the military situation was so atrocious that you just hated to go. I went to the meetings in New York City. They had a unit there. But these old birds from World War I would sit around and relive the war instead of studying and planning and training and whatever. And went through all this rigmarole. And we younger guys had to sit around because they outranked us. We had to sit around and listen to all that stuff month in and month out. So I just, when it came time to renew, I just faded out. But then when the war came, here I sat with a dormant or an expired second lieutenant commission, and the draft was breathing down my neck right away after Pearl Harbor. And so I reapplied. I applied for reinstatement, and I would get letters saying, "Okay, your application is being considered and will be acted on in due time." Well, I turned that over to the draft board and told them that this was pending. What about it? They said, well, we'll give you another 30 days or whatever. And that 30 days had expired and we still wouldn't hear from them. So finally, I just went ahead and said, well, I'll go ahead and enlist, and then if it does come through, I'll have it forward to go wherever I go. So I did. I went to Edgewood Arsenal, which was the chemical headquarters of the whole work.
That's in Maryland?
Service at that point, now it's Chemical Corps, I think. So
Just
I
out of
stayed there and
Baltimore,
took
isn't it?
basic training all over again, which was all right, because I was pretty rusty on even KP. And went through all of that thing again, and when I finished that, then they knew, because I had told the people there that I had a reinstatement application pending, so they just helped me there, kind of in a holding pattern for a few weeks, and then they said, well, while you're waiting, you might as well take ROTC because you'll need that again. You'll need that training in any case, which is again all right. So I did go through and got my commission.
And that was then by
That was in
late
42. I
mid
guess it was.
42, late 42. How long did it take him to?
It was a 90-day course, 3-month course.
They called them the 90-day wonders,
but
these
that-
second lieutenants.
I think it was. I might have got that commission in the fall of 41. No, Pearl Harbor
Pearl Harbor
was
was
41.
December
So it was the following year, 42.
Okay.
And so then I turned around and taught in the chemical warfare officer training school.
In Washington. Or
It's
still in Edgewood?
Still in Edgewood. I stayed right there.
Okay.
Where I graduated from. And I turned around and started teaching in the same school.
Which was the basis essentially of your teaching
In a way,
background for.
it helped out to be able to, get some teaching experience actually. Because previously at Rose Tech and all that was just pure, pretty
Engineering.
well technical work, only not teaching. And so while I was there, I had a good friend teaching with me. He got assigned to Washington in the Office of the Chief Chemical Warfare Service. And I went on, was continuing to teach, and one day I got a call from him saying there was an opening in the Office of the Chief Chemical Warfare Service. So would I consider coming down? Of course, in the Army, they don't usually say, would you consider? They say, you will report. But there they wanted somebody that was not drafted in it. They just said, there is an opening, would you like to be transferred? And so I either didn't know any better or whatever. Anyway, it was something to look good. So I said, oh, yeah, sure. So we got orders to Washington and spent the rest of the war right there.
Doing what? More teaching or research?
Courses, designing of chemical warfare courses for the various schools throughout the Army.
At all levels, essentially, or
Well, it was different courses, but primarily, not primarily necessarily the officer candidate school, but for chemical warfare training in general for the troops and so forth. We had a half a dozen or 10 courses scattered throughout the whole works. So that's what I did all during the war. Just work on that. Until we finished up in 45.
No, 46 actually.
Well, we got married in 45, and then I stayed on and came down in March or April of 46, I guess.
I can't pass up this tidbit that was thrown out a while ago about your being associated with some other girl at that point when Mother met you.
Well, like all service guys, I guess you have a girlfriend once in a while, and Washington was crawling with them, I don't mind telling you. They were beautiful girls from all over. They just went there in droves as a result of the recruitment of secretarial help from all over. And of course, I knew a few of them, and that was...
Well, I thought you knew
just
this girl in
before.
Baltimore before you ever came there, though, didn't you?
I don't know.
Somebody left over from
Well,
Hopkins days.
Well, yeah, I thought that,
well, I probably did.
didn't she
did
go to
see
that
her
girls'
at,
school over there? Not Galladay.
There was a Goucher College
Goucher.
there, and there, when we were in,
Edgewood Arsenal, I thought you,
Baltimore, which is about 15 miles outside, I guess, or something like that, outside of Baltimore. Then we did come in to the church there for the social deal, and I went back to the church that I was connected with when I was a student at Hopkins, which
the
is
same
in Baltimore.
church.
So I just knew this church from 32 or 3. See, this was 10 or 12 years later, and when I was stationed then at Edgewood, well, I came into the church, and there's where I knew these people. Yes.
well, so I thought you knew Helen Player there.
Well, yeah, I did. That's right. She was from Baltimore.
And she
I
was
had
in the
forgotten.
Waves and assigned to Washington. Is that when your relationship renewed there, or
Mhm. Yeah. We just
or did she get assigned there because you were there?
Well, I think again, you don't get assigned. You take whatever is given to you. Anyway, I know her more or less casually.
What happened to the mill during the war years?
Robert ran it.
Robert?
And
He was old enough to be free of draft responsibility?
Yeah, he had a family at that time, and I didn't. And Pauline was with us. You know Pauline, don't you? She was with us all that time, and so she and he, and then they hired another person or so, whatever, and carried on until it was over with. And after the war, we went back and rehooked on there. There again, a decision was required after Pearl Harbor, not after Pearl Harbor, after Hiroshima and all. The thing wound down quickly, more or less quickly. That was in the fall. And they started dropping people out of the service just overnight. Everybody that could would go home. Well, they offered us an opportunity to stay on. This is in the fall to help. What did they call it? Help
Process people out of them.
decommission the schools and leave them in something other than just walk out and leave an empty building, and the paperwork and everything just dropped. Everything just went down like that. So they needed somebody to help ease this thing down in some orderly manner. So it was midwinter, or coming into the winter, and I asked Robert if he minded if I stayed on, and they had things under good control. So we stayed on through that until the next April.
Winter of 45,
After the war was
46.
over, it was quite a few months. And during that time, they offered me a permanent job as a commissioned officer to stay in, and I was a captain at that point, I guess. To stay in the Army as a career. And it was something of a temptation to stay.
Yeah, he would have
It's a good
stayed
day.
except for me, I expect. I wanted to raise our kids in a little town.
Anyway, we decided not to do that. Came on back then in 46, and hooked on in Brazil and stayed there. Then 10 years additional, and that's when all you kids were born, up to 56 when we came down here.
And okay, and you went back to a house that you built in the 7 years you were there.
During the late 30s, I was living there with my mother and sisters and so forth, because I was completely footloose and everything. So I had bought a piece of property out north of Brazil there on 59 and designed and had built that little house.
And there was a Cole Street house too. Was that a later acquisition after you came back, or when did that come in?
No, that was during that time.
Honey, the Cole Street house you bought when your mother was about.
Well, that's what I was trying to line up at what time, though.
That was about 19.
Oh, that was after we were all there.
Yes.
Yeah, She was living down south of Brazil. You know where, we probably pointed out where we did live south of
Yeah,
Brazil, there just
right, I
south
probably
far.
couldn't find it, but I know roughly.
That's where they moved, that's where my father moved and was living there when he was killed. He was going down home on that road when
Now,
he was hit.
when did they leave the farm to move there?
Well, while I was in New York or Boston or Baltimore, I'm not sure just which, because I wasn't there. But they did leave the farm. They owned it for a while, didn't sell it, but they moved on up closer to town, so they wouldn't have that. Well, it was only 5 miles, but still it was a drive. And yes,
A 5-mile commute these days sounds pretty good.
Mother stayed on down there with Edna and
Pauline and Marjorie,
Pauline and Marge. The whole crew was there, wasn't they?
those three.
Yeah, and then they gradually got married and left off. Edna was the only one left with her at the time she died, or the time she was having to look after that place, and so we thought it would be simpler for her, because Edna was planning to get married.
In June.
Right, so that was
June
too
of
much
48.
too much for her to look after. So this Cole Street house became available, and we just thought we'd buy it, and she could move up there.
It'd be a
And,
smaller place to keep and be
something-
near us to look in on her.
There's a little store right next to her and all, but she died in the meantime, never did occupy it. So we had that to rent out then, as just until we got rid of it. And that, we still owned that, and we came down here, and Pauline looked after the business angle of it over a number of years. And then we finally sold it, just because we didn't have any particular use for it. It was the business to look after. So we came down here then in '56.
You know the rest.
Most of the rest of it, I think I can piece together. You said, though, after the war, Edna and Pauline and Marge were living with your mom in the South 59 house?
That was after his dad's death,
Right.
not after the war.
When was, oh, okay, not after the war.
No.
Because Aunt Pauline got
She
married,
was married, right.
when was,
She was married during the war. She and Les, during the war
But
also.
you spoke of when your mom moved up, or when your parents lived there on South 59, that the 3 girls lived there, and that was before you left for the war.
yeah, okay, that fits in pretty well.
That was in the 30s.
Not before I left for New York, though. I wasn't at home when they moved to that house off the farm. They were living, all of them were living on the farm when I left for New York after Rose Polly, right?
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So that's about hooks it up there to 56, and from 56, you guys have a smattering of what happened from then on.
Do you need any gaps filled in?
Yeah.
I guess we'll call it at that. I appreciate it. That was a good synopsis, and
Well,
it
it's
did clean up a bunch of.
off the cuff sometimes. It's a little hard to get it in sequence or remember just what did happen.